Picture this. You're huddled in the corner of a dank stone cell beneath Rome's amphitheatre, 73 BC. Iron shackles have chewed your wrists raw. Overhead, the deafening roar of 50,000 voices shakes the air as gladiators fight and bleed for the crowd's amusement. The reek of blood and sawdust seeps through the grates, mingling with the hot stench of sweat from the 24 other men crammed around you in darkness. Your Roman name is Marcus, but you were born Cleomia in Thrace before Roman legions chained you and dragged you across half the known world. Tomorrow, they'll oil your body, press a sword into your hands, one you barely know how to wield, and shove you into the arena. But tonight, down in this choking blackness, something unexpected happens. A gladiator named Spartacus leans close and begins to whisper of boundaries, of limits, of laws carved in blood and bronze, rules that even the almighty Roman master couldn't break. You barely dare to breathe as he speaks of ancient lines scrawled into imperial legal codes, etched into bronze tablets, debated in echoing marble halls. Words that insist even slaves have souls no man can truly own. Even human property has rights that cannot be entirely stripped away. Before we dive into these forgotten truths, stories of pain, resistance, and twisted justice, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden parts of history, hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this. And comment below where you're watching from. It's incredible to explore the past with people all over the world, bound by curiosity across time and space. The chains binding 20% of Rome's population weren't just metal. They were forged from law, tradition, economics, and the cold logic of empire. Yet even inside this monstrous machine, this empire that treated human beings as livestock, bought and sold like amphorae beneath statues of justice, there were lines, limits, boundaries even the wealthiest master hesitated to cross. To understand those limits, we must descend into the dark engine room of Roman slavery. Not as moral tourists, but as forensic historians, digging through crumbling laws, broken stone, and twisted logic to see how human bondage really worked. What we'll find challenges everything we think we know about absolute power and the fragments of dignity it couldn't quite erase. By the 1st century BC, Rome had become a slave-making machine. Every military conquest fed it. When Pompey crushed the pirates of Sicily in 67 BC, he sold 20,000 captives in a single day on Delos. When Caesar butchered his way through Gaul, 1 million Celts were slaughtered and another 1 million were sold in chains. Rome's heartbeat was the rhythm of slave markets, the crack of whips, the shuffle of bare feet on polished stone. Walk through any wealthy Roman household, and slaves were everywhere. Unseen hands cooked the meals, scrubbed the floors, copied texts, taught the children, and warmed the beds. They braided hair, carried litters, managed accounts. Without slaves, Rome would have collapsed in a week. But even in this brutal flesh economy, Roman law, cruel though it was, still operated. A system of rules that bound even those who wrote them. And if a master broke those rules, the consequences could be severe, from social disgrace to full-on criminal prosecution, from losing fortune to being exiled from the only world that mattered to them. The first, and most shocking, limitation. A Roman master couldn't legally kill a slave without justification. This wasn't compassion, it was economics. A slave was an investment. Some cost more than a skilled laborer's annual salary. To destroy such expensive property without a valid reason was seen as reckless waste, and waste offended Roman values almost as much as weakness. More importantly, random killing was a threat to social stability. If masters could slaughter slaves on a whim, fear would turn to fury and rebellion. The Roman system ran on fear, yes, but calculated fear. Kill too few, and slaves might grow bold. Kill too many, and who would do the labor? So Roman law drew tight, cruel lines. Masters could kill, but only with cause. Theft, rebellion, attacking a free person, sexual misconduct, defiance. Each killing had to serve a function. Punishment, deterrence, or eliminating danger, forbidden. This wasn't just a legal stance, it was social. A master known for senseless cruelty could find himself cut off from business deals, political favors, and the tightly woven networks of elite Roman life. And under specific laws about property damage or public disruption, the state could even bring charges. But the biggest deterrent was money. Dead slaves didn't work. A skilled Greek tutor, a trained Syrian chef, a loyal Germanic guard, these people were worth fortunes. Killing them was like setting fire to a bank vault. It led to a disturbing moral calculus. Slaves didn't live because Romans valued life, they lived because they produced profit. A cook might be spared, a ditch digger, not so much. The law didn't protect people, it protected things. But since slaves were things, they earned a perverse kind of safety from that very status. The second major boundary, religion. In Rome, religion wasn't personal. It was public duty, a performance of loyalty to the gods and the state. Slaves were expected to take part in household rituals, in civic festivals, in the sacred calendar of Roman life. But they couldn't be forced to betray their own core spiritual beliefs or commit acts that violated the deepest taboos of their native traditions. This wasn't spiritual freedom. It was pure pragmatism. Slaves ripped from their homelands, torn from families, stripped of language and identity, needed something to hold on to just to stay sane. And for many, religion was that anchor. A slave who could whisper prayers in his own tongue, honor the festivals of childhood, or simply believe his God still watched, was less likely to fall into despair, less likely to revolt, less likely to choose suicide. Roman masters learned the hard way. Forcing full religious conversion often broke slaves so completely they became useless. A Celtic druid made to sacrifice to Jupiter might obey outwardly but rot inside, growing lifeless and unproductive. A Jewish scribe told to eat pork might starve rather than defile himself. A Germanic warrior forced to praise Mars over Woden might channel that rage into bloodshed. So, Roman law adapted. A compromise formed, not out of mercy, but pure calculation. Slaves had to take part in public religion. That was non-negotiable. Public rites, civic rituals, household gods, those upheld loyalty and social order. But what slaves did in private, that was left alone. In hidden corners of Roman homes, strange scenes unfolded. A Celtic girl leaving offerings to her triple goddess behind a curtain. A Jewish cook quietly lighting Sabbath candles at dusk. A German guard whispering to Odin before sparring. An Egyptian scribe sketching protective hieroglyphs on scraps of papyrus. All of this happened while they still bowed publicly to Jupiter, Minerva, and Mars. Masters who crushed this thin sliver of spiritual privacy often paid the price. Desperate slaves made poor workers, or dangerous ones. Some took their own lives rather than defile their gods. Others transformed their devotion into vengeance, seeing their bondage as a holy war between their gods and Rome's. Some escaped, and when they did, they carried stories of religious persecution back home, fueling resistance, making future conquests bloodier and more expensive. The third limit was even more complicated. Slave sales couldn't casually break emotional bonds. Yes, Roman law acknowledged that even slaves had attachments to lovers, to children, to friends, and tearing those bonds apart without care, that could spark collapse or revenge. Not because of sentiment, because of risk. A slave who lost everything, his kids sent to a distant province, his wife given to another man, his closest companions scattered across the empire, was a powder keg. He had nothing left to lose. That kind of grief turned into sabotage, suicide, murder, or escape. So, Roman law created guidelines, not out of kindness, but to keep the machine running. Slave families could be separated, but not at random. A master selling a skilled artisan might be expected to include his apprentice son, keeping both productive and emotionally stable. A loyal nursemaid might only be sold if her own children remained close. preventing her from breaking down. These rules were thin, often ignored, but they existed. Slave traders known for ripping apart families earned reputations for unstable, dangerous merchandise. Masters who shattered long-standing bonds without reason soon found their remaining slaves full of fear, wondering if they were next. How tightly these protections were followed depended on local culture, the temperament of the master, and the economic climate. During financial collapse, families were torn apart without thought. In military campaigns, emotions were a casualty of logistics. But during times of peace and profit, smart masters understood. Preserving slave relationships was good business. This twisted system birthed a warped form of slave family law. Slave marriages weren't legally recognized, but they had economic value. Slave children had no inheritance rights, but they were future labor. Slave friendships weren't legally protected, but they kept households functioning. The fourth major boundary: torture and mutilation. Yes, Roman law allowed it. Slaves could be tortured for confessions, punished for crimes, or branded for escape attempts. But this violence had limits. It had to be useful. Sadistic violence, off limits. Torture had rules. It had to match the offense. It had to serve a goal: extracting truth, enforcing discipline, or marking defiance. And it had to preserve the slave's ability to work. You could brand the runaway with fug across the forehead, fugitivus, but you couldn't mutilate them into uselessness. Why? Because the economy came first. These limits were enforced through the same tools that constrained slave killing: social pressure, financial cost, and occasional legal threat. A master known for brutal excess was pushed out of elite circles. Damaging valuable slaves wasn't seen as cruelty. It was seen as stupidity. Romans prized self-control. A master who couldn't control his temper wasn't trusted with wealth or politics. And beneath it all lurked fear. Rome knew that cruelty bred retaliation. A master who tortured for fun risked poisoned meals, burned villas, or even attacks on his children. Violence, when measured, kept order. Violence unleashed invited disaster. This legal system wasn't compassionate, it was coldly efficient. The framework for slave torture appears in Justinian's Digest, compiled in the 6th century AD, but drawing from centuries of precedent. Slaves could be tortured in legal proceedings, but only under certain conditions and with oversight. They could be punished for breaking household rules, but the punishment had to match the infraction and serve discipline. The result: a warped world where cruelty wasn't banned, it was regulated. A master could legally whip a slave for stealing food, but whipping just to enjoy the screams. That crossed the line, not legally but socially. Even Rome, an empire built on chains, understood uncontrolled cruelty threatened the very system that fed it. The difference came down to three things: intent, proportion, and purpose. These ideas offered slaves only thin protection, but they laid the groundwork for limiting absolute power. The fifth restriction dealt with something far more subtle: slave testimony in court. Roman judges knew a brutal truth: slaves could be forced to lie under oath. A master could easily coerce his property into saying anything, turning the courtroom into a weapon. If that happened, slave testimony became unreliable, dangerous even. So Roman law crafted a complicated workaround. Slaves could testify, but their words carried less weight than those of free citizens, and testifying against their own masters, that was allowed only under extreme conditions: treason, murder, or crimes threatening the state itself. These limits were enforced both legally and socially. Masters suspected of coaching their slaves found their reputations damaged. Judges started discounting their testimony in future trials. Courts also developed ways to catch lies, separating slaves during questioning, comparing their statements for rehearsed patterns. This restriction served many functions. It stopped masters from using slaves to frame rivals. It acknowledged that tortured slaves would say anything to stop the pain. and it subtly recognized that justice needed a layer of independence between the witness and the accused. But that protection, still full of holes. Slaves couldn't easily testify against their masters, but could be tortured for testimony about their master's enemies. Their words carried less legal weight, but if they were found lying or giving weak answers, they could be punished brutally. Roman law shielded slaves from certain abuses while leaving them vulnerable to others. The sixth limit wasn't written into law, it was economic. Masters couldn't waste slave labor in ways that hurt the broader economy or clashed with community expectations. This was enforced through social pressure, not statutes, ostracism, boycotts, and exclusion from elite circles. Roman life was a constant race for wealth, prestige, and alliances. A master who squandered skilled labor, neglected slave health, or used slaves in tasteless ways would be quietly cut off from the networks that powered elite survival. This was especially important when it came to skilled and intellectual slaves. If you owned a Greek philosopher, a Syrian doctor, or a master metalworker, society expected you to use them properly, sending a brilliant physician to dig trenches. That was like scrubbing floors with vintage wine, burning priceless sculptures for heat. The social consequences were subtle but crushing. People stopped lending you money. Invitations disappeared. Partnerships dried up. Behind your back, whispers grew about your lack of refinement and poor judgment. This created an odd layer of protection for educated slaves. Their skills made them too valuable to misuse. A Greek tutor versed in rhetoric couldn't be wasted in the mines. A Germanic forge master crafting elite weapons was far too vital to toss into the arena. A Jewish financier managing complex trade routes was too profitable to damage. But this protection applied only to those with economic worth. Unskilled slaves. No such luck. Field laborers, domestic workers, basic servants. They could be used up and discarded with no consequence. Rome's slave system protected assets, not lives. The seventh, and maybe most surprising limitation, masters couldn't legally block slaves from earning and keeping small amounts of money. This was known as the peculium, a loophole that created a shadow economy inside slavery. Technically, the master still owned it, but in practice, a slave could earn extra cash from side work, tips, or small trades, and most masters let them keep it because it was useful. This system served several purposes. It gave slaves incentive to work harder and behave better. It gave them something to strive for, often the chance to one day buy their freedom. More than anything, it acknowledged something dangerous to the Roman system. Slaves had ambition. They were still human. The peculium led to complex relationships. A skilled craftsman might use his savings to buy better tools, boosting both his output and his value. A servant could use tips to buy fine clothing, elevating both her image and the household's prestige. An agricultural slave might invest in livestock, growing his own worth as property. Masters who seized a slave's peculium without good reason sparked serious backlash. Other elites viewed it as petty, even self-defeating, and slaves who lost their hard-earned savings. They turned sullen, slower, resentful, sometimes dangerous. The peculium also forged bonds between freedmen and the enslaved. A former slave might loan money to friends still in bondage, helping them buy freedom or improve conditions. These networks gave slaves hope, and gave Rome another reason not to crush their spirits completely. But make no mistake, the peculium was still a tool of control. It dangled just enough hope to keep slaves working, dreaming, striving, without ever truly letting them go. Masters crafted the illusion of opportunity and progress, while keeping the power structure firmly intact. A slave who had scraped together half the money for freedom was far less likely to revolt than one who saw no hope at all. The system offered just enough movement to hold off despair, while keeping most people permanently chained. The eighth limitation involved how slave children were treated. Roman law recognized these children as future assets, and masters who neglected or brutalized them were essentially destroying their own investment. Romans also understood that kids raised under constant savagery often became dangerously unstable adults, posing threats to household safety and productivity. Slave children couldn't be worked like grown men, couldn't be punished the same way, and needed a minimum of care to survive to working age. These protections were thin. Slave children still faced forced separation, sexual abuse, and training for lifelong servitude, but some limits on their treatment existed simply for practical reasons. Roman ideals around family also shaped this. Romans valued certain aspects of childhood, and a household seen as abusive, even towards slave children, could draw social backlash. Masters who built reputations for cruelty toward the young risked losing their standing in the community. These rules were shaky, inconsistently enforced, and often ignored, but they still drew another line around total power. A master who worked slave children to death, starved them, or tortured them beyond what was age-appropriate could face consequences ranging from public shame to losing future profits when children died before becoming productive. The ninth limit was even messier: sexual boundaries. Roman sexual culture ran on honor, status, and expectations of proper conduct, even between masters and slaves. Roman men were expected to be sexually dominant, with no legal barriers to penetrating anyone of lower status. But they were also supposed to maintain standards that matched their rank as family heads and elite citizens. Crossing certain lines, public sexual violence, humiliating acts that disgusted guests or neighbors, could bring social exclusion, political disgrace, even legal blowback. Masters could legally rape their slaves, but they couldn't do it in ways that clashed with Roman virtue. Elite Roman men had to manage their sexual lives with discretion and a sense of decorum, even when exercising brutal power. And there were cultural red lines, forcing a Jewish slave into foreign cult sex rituals, or compelling a Germanic warrior into acts considered deeply shameful in his own culture, could provoke resistance so intense it turned to violence or suicide. Sexual exploitation was everywhere and largely legal, but still not completely free of boundaries. Masters with a reputation for humiliating or extremely public sexual cruelty might see their status collapse. Driving valuable slaves to suicide through sexual abuse could mean serious financial losses. Most of all, any sexual behavior that signaled a master lacked self-control threatened his wider authority. These sexual restraints were small and rarely enforced, but they showed even absolute power had cultural lines that couldn't be crossed without fallout. The 10th and final boundary was a last resort appeal. Masters could not fully block slaves from going to higher authorities if the abuse got extreme. This right of appeal was narrow, dangerous, and usually ineffective, but it existed as a final check on the worst forms of private tyranny. Slaves who could prove their master had crossed legal or social boundaries could plead their case to magistrates, governors, even the emperor. These appeals rarely worked, and failure could mean horrific punishment, but the mere possibility put a brake on master behavior and sometimes saved lives. Appeals worked best for skilled or valuable slaves, whose mistreatment amounted to destroying an economic asset, or when a master's behavior threatened public order or outraged deeply rooted Roman values. A Greek philosopher tortured for unpopular teachings, a Syrian doctor blocked from healing, or a Germanic warrior forced into vile sexual acts might reach sympathetic Roman officials who worried about the wider fallout. Romans believed authority should look dignified and deliberate. A master who acted like a savage undermined the entire social hierarchy. But appealing was always risky. A failed appeal could lead to torture, mutilation, or death. Even a successful one often ended with being sold to a new master rather than gaining true freedom. This system offered only the barest protections while still defending the overall power structure. All 10 of these boundaries formed a tangled web of legal, social, and economic restraints that curbed the total authority Romans claimed over human property. None of these limits delivered real freedom or dignity. All were regularly broken with minimal consequence. But together, they mark something new in history, a system trying to regulate absolute domination over other humans. These contradictions cut to the heart of Roman slavery. Romans needed their slaves to be objects, bought, sold, and used without limits. But Rome didn't just need slaves as property. It needed them as people, thinking, feeling, skilled workers who could fuel the empire's machine. This was the heart of the contradiction. Every limit placed on a master's power acknowledged a slave's humanity while still denying them freedom. Every so-called protection reinforced their status as objects, just ones that came with rules. Every line drawn around authority didn't weaken the system, it held it up. These limitations explain how Roman slavery didn't collapse under its own cruelty. The system was designed to be just flexible enough to keep people functioning and just brutal enough to keep them terrified. It walked a tightrope, give slaves hope, but never too much, give them dignity, but never control. But those very restraints exposed the rot. Every protection hinted that slaves could suffer, that they deserved dignity, that they were, undeniably, human. Every rule placed on masters admitted a deeper truth. Unchecked power over another human being is dangerous, volatile, bound to break. The enslaved knew this. The ones hidden in the dark beneath the amphitheatre, listening to Spartacus whisper of laws and limits, they saw what their owners refused to. Power that must limit itself has already lost its moral ground. Authority that needs rules to stay in line is already admitting it's unjust. When Spartacus and his followers finally escaped that underground prison, they didn't rise up with just rage. They rose with knowledge. They understood how the system worked, and more importantly, where it cracked. Roman slavery wasn't all-powerful. It survived because masters chose not to unleash its full cruelty every time. That choice, that restraint, made it vulnerable. The rebellion that followed was more than an uprising. It was a reckoning. These weren't just angry slaves. They were people who had studied their oppression, who knew exactly what to break, where to push, and how to tear the entire structure apart. Their revolt lasted 2 years. It terrified Rome, and when it was crushed in 71 BC, the price was brutal. 6,000 crucified along the Appian Way. A message to the rest, submit or suffer. But the message backfired, because even that punishment proved the point. Absolute power isn't absolute if it has to warn people. Even property can rebel. Even slaves can choose death over bondage. And as Romans walked past those crosses, staring at the bodies of men who dared to claim their humanity, they knew deep down that their system wasn't as stable as they pretended. The rules that kept slaves alive, they were never for the slaves, they were for the masters. They were signs that Rome understood. If you push people too far, they will snap back. If you treat humans like things, eventually they remind you they're not. In the end, Rome admitted what it tried so hard to hide. Absolute power corrupts not just the oppressed, but the ones who wield it. Those crucified men knew that. They'd lived the lie of regulated slavery and seen its fatal flaw. Any system that needs limits has already exposed its weakness. Any authority that requires boundaries has already lost its claim to justice. So as you leave this story into a world where slavery has gone in name, but its structures linger, remember what Spartacus learned in the shadows. Power that accepts limits reveals its fragility. Authority that fears rebellion exposes its own guilt. And when the oppressed understand the chains that bind them, they've already begun to break them. The arena is silent now. The crosses are gone. The empire is dust. But the question still echoes. What couldn't owners do to slaves? The answer, then as now, reveals not mercy, but the fierce, unbreakable dignity of those they try to own.